Hey everyone, Jeff Dorman, Chief Investment Officer at Arca, back again for another edition of That's Our Two Satoshis Live, where we talk about everything happening in the crypto markets, like we do every week and have for basically 8 years now. I'm joined by my partner of almost as much time, almost 7 years working together now,
Yeah,
David Nage, Portfolio Manager here at Arca. How are you, sir?
great to be with you, Jeff. 7 years. Wow. Time flies.
Yeah, well, I would say during parts of those 7 years, people in crypto have been happier than they are right now. Certainly a little bit of misery going on in the market.
Yeah.
Um, Not been a great year for crypto. Not been a terrible year, but it hasn't been a great year. And certainly hasn't been a great year relative to some other asset classes, which I think is probably what's bumming most people out. But more importantly, at least in terms of week over week and what's happening, most people probably know of David for his work on the private investment side at Arca, but also, sort of a group effort here on the macro side and really kind of bringing together all of our different experiences throughout investing prior to getting involved in crypto. And David, you've been spending a lot of time both on the Washington policy front as well as more recently on some of the plumbing happening with regard to the government shutdown and what that means both from a liquidity standpoint in the repo market as well as how that's trickling down or isn't to the crypto market.
Yep.
Let's start there. I mean, what has actually happened in the beginning of the government shutdown versus maybe where we're at today versus where you see us kind of heading in the future?
I think the best way to describe it right now is that the shutdown has created a two-headed monster. On one side of it, there is a potential very nice catalyst for risk assets, especially digital assets. And on the other side, there is the potential for disaster for years of work on the regulatory side that may just go into the abyss. And so we'll talk about that. So, what I have been looking at for the last few weeks, especially as it relates to, as you said, the plumbing, and why I've been doing that, as you alluded to, is my primary job here is running our venture book and working on all of that. A lot of our teams are trying to go through token generation events. They're trying to get into the market at a good time when sentiment is good. And so it's important for me to look to see gauges of sentiment, if you will. And so I started to get very interested in things like the TGA, which is a Treasury General Account. The Treasury General Account, for those that don't know, is basically like the US government's checking account at the Federal Reserve. It's where all federal tax revenues are deposited and where all federal spending comes from. And so what happened over the course of the last, call it 40 days now, 41 days, is that at the end of September into the beginning of October, that checking account started to get bigger and bigger every single day, upwards of about $10 billion a day. And what we started to see is that every 100 billion of that added somewhere in the range of 4 to 8 basis points of growth in what's called the SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. These are all things that Jeff knows incredibly well because he spent years and years and years looking at these things every single day. Not everyone does.
Used to be called LIBOR. Used to be called LIBOR, but so far.
Exactly. And this is based on the actual Treasury repo transactions, which for a fancy word is basically lend and borrowing between banks. And so why does this all get very interesting is because when the shutdown happened, again, the appropriations, the spending side of the the Fed Reserve, kind of the checking account from the government, started to take in money as it normally does, but it didn't have the ability to spend it. Now people are like, oh, okay, well, if it gets to be so big, then that's probably a good thing. Well, no, because it's locked in there. There is no way, there is no mechanism to spend that unless there is a proper appropriation. And so when the government was shut down, that money was locked and frozen. And it does nothing, basically good for anything out there except causes liquidity strains on banks. And so you started to see this happen over and over again, day in, day out. I was looking at the rates. And at the end of October, as we fast forward through the month, we had a massive $50 billion tranche of capital that the banks basically said that they needed because they were having some potential problems. What's very interesting at that point in time is that, as it was scheduled, the Federal Reserve Chairman Powell had a meeting already scheduled right around October 30th, 31st, right around Halloween. And they acknowledged they started to see the stresses happening in the lend borrow part of the market. They started to see that the SOFR rate had hit 4.36%, which is fairly well above the normal 4% that they usually like to have it as a target. And so that was something that they had acknowledged. He made full transparency on it. And it's really my opinion that when he acknowledged that, and he said, yeah, we're seeing this, that everyone started to calm down. Why? Because they knew at the end of the day, as you know this better than anybody, there's always the Fed put. The Fed is not going to let things get so chaotic that we come into another 2008, 2009 crisis again. That is why they have the SOFR. That's why they have the standing repo facility that they put into place, where if there's an emergency, the banks can go in there and pull capital, as long as they obviously have collateral.
Well, I think that's an important point, though, right? Because back when we've had similar issues, like in 2019, the standing repo facility didn't exist at the time. And when you saw, again, there's a very big difference between liquidity and certainly interbank liquidity versus solvency issues, right? You mentioned 2008, that became a solvency issue, right? There was bad debt everywhere. Banks were scared to lend to each other because of actual default risk. That's very different than just a liquidity issue, which is, as treasuries and cash are sloshing back and forth in the system, and banks have different equity requirements in terms of how much capital they have to hold on their balance sheet. A liquidity issue is very different than a solvency issue. But even in a liquidity issue, things can get bad if there's not facilities in place to alleviate some of that tension. And as you mentioned, 2019, there was a real big issue. It didn't last very long, but there was a real big issue with repo, and the Fed did put in the SRF, the standing repo facility, which was designed to be sort of the lender of last resort to make sure that these liquidity issues didn't become a bigger deal. So to your point there, I think even though there are real issues happening with the plumbing right now, nobody really believed this was going to get out of hand, partly because of the SRF and partly because of what you said. The Fed basically came in and said what everyone knew they were going to say anyway, which is that we acknowledge this and we're not going to let it become a huge problem.
Right.
And that's why, in my opinion, you're not really seeing swap spreads blow out. You're not really seeing credit spreads blow out, right? There doesn't seem to be any actual contagion here, but yet it is a drain on actual liquidity.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and just so for people understanding, one of the things that Chairman Powell also acknowledged is that they were going to end quantitative tightening at the beginning of December. Quantitative tightening, for those that don't know and aren't tracking this, is roughly about $24 billion a day that's pulling out liquidity in from the market. And so that right there, again, could be considered a quote unquote type of injection or quantitative easing, if you will. But you have, he made full mentioning that they were ending quantitative tightening at the beginning of December as well. So why does this all matter to us? Why does this all matter to digital assets? Is that, again, you have the checking account, as I said, at the government, the TGA, which for all intent and purposes, there is no rate, there is no amount that they typically have to keep in there. It has been stated that they like to keep about 5 to 7 business days of expenses and capital in there just in case. And so that would be roughly anywhere between $700 to $800 billion, give or take. And so what things got kind of dicey at the end of December, at the end of October into the beginning of November, is that the TGA hit over $1 trillion. And so what the kind of the speculation and what the kind of prognostication could be is that now that the shutdown is coming into view, that we're possibly ending this, thank goodness, over the course of the next few days. And if you look at Polymarket, there's 95% chance that this ends in the next 2 to 3 days. That's definitely fluctuated over the last few days. But if that ends, effectively, that TGA immediately starts draining. And so there's anywhere upwards of between 100 to 150 billion plus dollars of capital that starts rushing back into the banks. That, again, could look like, an injection or quantitative easing or things of that we've seen in the past. And what we've seen in the past, as you alluded to, of the 2019 episode, you saw obviously a very positive response with Bitcoin and other digital assets. Now, we didn't have a robust industry at that time. We didn't have thousands of different digital assets at that moment in time. So Bitcoin is kind of the asset. But the other one that you started to see is March of 2020. The Fed injected at that moment in time, and you saw Bitcoin going from 3,800 to 60,000 over that year. The period between January and April of 2023, there was another TGA episode where there was a drawdown And once they started putting capital back to work, the Bitcoin rallied from 16 or 17,000 to 30,000. So there is empirical evidence that when these episodes happen, when you've had some sort of fiscal calamity, if you will, and then there is a fix, a restoration of kind of the norm, that digital assets and risk assets especially start to perform better. So that's kind of the first head of the two-headed monster.
But here's the problem with that, right? This one specifically is coinciding with the government shutdown. During the last 6 government shutdowns, the S&P 500 is up 2.2, or is up on average the last 6 government shutdowns, and it's up again 2.2% during this government shutdown as well. So the equity market has basically said, we don't care about the government shutdown. The lack of liquidity in the system being caused by this drainage of the TGA is not affecting the equity market. Why is it affecting, in your opinion, the crypto market so much, and why do you think it'll snap back when this alleviates itself?
Again, from what we know is that there are not that many levers that affect, crypto is very sentiment driven. As you say many times, the fundamentals, yes, we try to do amazing fundamental work on the kind of the expansion of the asset class and the different DeFi protocols and the different, layer ones, even if you can do that, which to Jeff's bane, it's very hard to do. But, a lot of what's driven by the kind of the momentum in the market is sentiment. And if you have, this kind of a fiscal issue, when you have, liquidity, when you have the other thing that we didn't necessarily talk about is that the banks are also under some duress lately, and this has made it into public kind of press, that there has been an elevation in auto loan defaults, which is about a $1.5 trillion space. And that default ratio is getting closer to about 7%. You're starting to see Tricolor in September and a few others starting to have some significant issues with fraud and other defaults. So, yeah, there is.
I would also caution there that the KRE, which is the S&P, the S&P regional banking ETF, is back within 5% of its all-time high or 5-year high. So again, what I'm getting at is here, everything you're saying is true, but almost every other part of the market has just looked through this and recognized that it's not actually a big deal, right? Credit spreads are maybe 10 or 20 basis points wider from the tights, but they're still basically at 5 and 10-year tights. Treasury yields have barely moved for the last 3 years. As you mentioned, the banking issues kind of went away immediately, and the KRE index is back up. It is the overreaction in crypto to the downside, in theory, then should be met with an overreaction to the upside, as you are alluding to, because of the fact that it is literally the only asset class that is being affected by these liquidity issues at the moment.
Again, there is that probability. We all look at things from a 0 to 1 kind of probability scale. I'm saying there's in my opinion right now, based off of what we've seen historically and the kind of the observable evidence, is that there is a non-zero sum potential that, yes, if and when the shutdown ends and we have this TGA drain, that risk on becomes in favor and that it potentially benefits the asset class. However, as we know, there are other things that have happened over the last few weeks that have also caused dampening of the sentiment of the asset class. Unforced errors, if you will, that have happened time and time again in this asset class because it's still maturing. So that is to be seen. It's just something that I wanted to call out and something that it was interesting to observe the data coming in. Now, the second part of this, as I said again, this kind of two-headed monster of the shutdown, is that we were making the industry and regulators and policymakers were making fantastic progress towards market structure. Now, as you all know, the Genius Act was passed this year, which is the Stablecoin Act, which is obviously, going to hopefully put forth some fantastic rules to create, regulated stablecoins that the market, not just crypto, but obviously traditional finance, starts to embrace and starts to use 24/7, 365. The Clarity Act is there to act as market structure. What does that mean? Fancy way for saying what is a security, what is a commodity, what are the rules of the road, how do we actually have pattern recognition on when things are coming into the market. And so that bill, the Clarity Act, passed the House in July. Very, very strong bipartisan support, 279 to 136. This is something that not everyone, obviously, 136 voted against it, but had a very strong amount of bipartisan support. And then it moves over to the Senate. and they've been working on that. And so Senator Tim Scott, I've also heard that Senator Gillibrand here in New York, and some others have been taking the lead and trying to really get this thing going and get this thing finished up by the end of the year. What happened with the shutdown is that basically everything stopped. Meetings stopped. The House obviously went, kind of shut down with this. Senate is basically lame duck right now. They're not really doing very much. People are not getting paid. People are furloughed. That includes staffers and everyone else that kind of is tertiary to this. And so this created a big kind of problem right now, is because for what I've heard, from, our folks in DC and people that we talk to and others that are in the space that are kind of policy wonks, is that with all of this progress, there was hope that this thing was going to be able to be passed this year. If it does slip into 2026, that is a midterm election year. And what can be seen is that most politicians at that moment in time become fairly risk adverse, meaning that they don't want to put their neck out for something that may be attacked. And we have all seen the attacks by those that do not like this industry and do not want this technology. And so you can imagine what those attack ads could be. And they would not be pleasant at all. And so what the fear is that if this does not get done now, if they do not open the government and they do not get this done now, that the Clarity Act could slip into 2026 and possibly, as I said, into the abyss. And so this is really important, because we have all wanted market structure in this industry. We've all wanted clarity as to what is a security, what is a commodity, how do we actually, review these things. If something is a security, can it morphosize into something that's a commodity, like the Hinman speech back years ago? And so this is what was really put forth, and this is what they've been trying to do. What I've seen, because they actually have winter recess that starts in the middle of December, they've got about 4 or 5 weeks. If they can open the government this week, they've got about 4 to 5 weeks, maybe, of getting this thing done. If they don't get it done, I'm very fearful that it falls into 26. And as I said again, I do not think that that's going to be good.
So if you had your best guess right now, based on, again, kind of how markets have responded, as well as, what you're hearing now out of Washington, what's your best guess in terms of what the highest probability event is over the next week or two, and ultimately what that means for markets?
I think one of the things I can pull from this is that, on what was actually just released yesterday, from the Senate Ag Committee, was a bill from 2 senators, Bozeman and Cory Booker from New Jersey. There does seem to be, again, bipartisan kind of work to try to get this thing done. So again, it does seem that there is enough goodwill and still enough bipartisanship here that they see that this is something that benefits both sides now. And so again, if they can, reopen the government by the end of this week, and the Senate just passed their thing that's sent back to the House. I think the House has to reconvene everyone and try to get everyone to vote on this thing. And apparently, based off of the majority, the Republicans probably have enough to pull it through. If they can get that done and it be signed by the president by the end of the week, and everyone gets back to work and everyone starts getting paid, thankfully, then yeah, there's about 4 or 5 weeks where they can sit down and they can get things done. I do think that they want to get things done. I think they also acknowledge that 26 is probably not going to be a very nice year. And it's not going to be filled with, good tidings and joy between the parties, even though you can't say that now. So I do think that they all see that they got to try to get it done now. So I think the energy is there. I think you're seeing, as I said again, the Senate Ag bill, the draft that came out yesterday from Bozeman and from Booker, was missing a few things, but it was also fairly well done. Congratulations to the staff that are probably working around the clock, maybe not getting paid to do that. I think, there's a lot of things that they're trying to do. And I would say anyone who's listening to this, please support, these efforts, because as an industry, we really do need this. This is important for us. We don't want this to fall, into the abyss, as I've said a few times already. This is something that Europe was able to do with MiCA. They were able to get that passed. They're on a trajectory to having regulatory compliance and a framework. This is something as an industry for us to grow and to be able to bring billions and trillions of dollars of institutional capital in, and have banks be able to support us with custody. This is something that really needs to get done. So if you're there, you're listening, please support the efforts. This is something that we need to have done by the end of this year.
Well, great. Well, David, thanks for coming on. And I think everybody should go to our blog and actually read what David put together on our blog, ar.ca/blog. He has a lot of great supporting evidence and charts about how markets have reacted to some of these government plumbing and spending and reserves issues in the past, what's happening with the Clarity Act, as well as what the midterm elections might mean, both good and bad for crypto going forward. So definitely check out the blog. And also, I would just say I'm already on record saying that I'm surprised Bitcoin isn't at all-time highs right now already, because historically things like government shutdowns have been good for Bitcoin. Anytime you lose trust in your local governments or your local banks, that's historically been good for Bitcoin specifically, which is actually, I think, why we shot up to 125, 40 or 45 days ago in the first place. So it's a little bit of a weird reaction that Bitcoin has done so poorly during a period of government stress. But if David is right, and some of this is just liquidity driven, offsetting the philosophical reasons for owning Bitcoin, then you might hit kind of the best of both worlds over the next couple of weeks and months here. So we'll see. Stay tuned. Check out the blog. David, thanks for joining. And everyone else, we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.